Picture this. You're 7 years old. It's a warm September evening in 1940, and you're playing with your toy soldiers on the living room floor. Suddenly, you hear it. That sound. A low, distant drone that makes your mother's face go white. Air raid sirens begin to wail across London like the screaming of 1,000 ghosts. Your father grabs you. No time for shoes. No time for your favorite teddy bear. You're running down the stairs of your apartment building, your heart pounding so hard you think it might burst through your chest. You can hear the bombers now, hundreds of them. The sound is like thunder that never stops. This isn't a movie. This isn't a history book. This was my childhood. My name is Thomas, and I was 7 years old when Hitler decided to bomb London into submission. For 8 months, night after night, the Luftwaffe tried to break us. They failed. But the cost? The cost was everything a child should never have to see. Today, I'm going to tell you what it was really like. Not the sanitized version you see in films. Not the heroic speeches and stiff upper lips. I'm going to tell you what it felt like to be a child when the world was trying to kill you. Because 85 years later, those memories still wake me up at night. And maybe, just maybe, if you understand what we went through, you'll understand why we can never let it happen again. So grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let me take you back. Back to a time when the sky rained fire. Back to when childhood ended for an entire generation. Back to the London Blitz. Are you ready? Because I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at your own childhood the same way again. Let me tell you about the London I knew before the bombs came. Because to understand what we lost, you need to know what we had. I grew up in Stepney, in the East End of London. Not the fancy part of the city, mind you. No, we were working class through and through. My dad worked at the docks, loading and unloading ships that came from all over the world. My mum worked part-time at a textile factory and spent the rest of her time keeping our small flat spotless and putting food on the table with whatever money we had. Our street was narrow, lined with terraced houses that all looked the same. Brick walls stained black from decades of coal smoke. Small windows that never seemed to let in enough light. But you know what? It was home, and it was beautiful in its own way. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of Mr. Henderson's horse and cart clopping down the cobblestones. He was the milkman, and he'd been delivering milk to our street for as long as anyone could remember. The bottles would clink together in their metal crates, making a sound that meant normalcy. That meant everything was okay. I'd go to St. Mary's Primary School, just 3 streets away. Miss Patterson was my teacher, and she was strict but fair. We'd learn our times tables, practice our handwriting, and read stories about knights and dragons. On Fridays, if we'd been good all week, she'd read us an extra chapter from whatever adventure book she'd brought in. After school, my friends and I would play in the street, kick the can, hopscotch, British bulldog. The girls would skip rope while singing songs their mothers had taught them. The boys would trade cigarette cards and pretend to be football players or soldiers or explorers. On Sundays, we'd all get dressed in our best clothes and go to church. St. Dunstan's, with its tall spire that you could see from anywhere in the neighborhood. After service, if we had a few pennies, Dad would buy us fish and chips wrapped in newspaper, and we'd eat them while walking through Victoria Park, watching the ducks on the pond. It wasn't a perfect life. We didn't have much money. Sometimes dinner was just bread and dripping. Sometimes my shoes had holes in them and we couldn't afford new ones, so Mum would stuff cardboard inside to cover the gap. But we had each other. We had our community. We had neighbors who'd help you if you needed it and who expected the same in return. And we had peace. I know that seems strange to say, because by 1940, Britain had already been at war with Germany for a year. But for most of that first year, for us kids in London, the war seemed very far away. We'd heard about something called the Phony War, where British and German forces sat across from each other in France but didn't really fight. We'd seen our fathers and older brothers sign up or get conscripted into the military. We'd started carrying gas masks in cardboard boxes everywhere we went, which seemed exciting and adventurous to us kids, if I'm honest. But the war hadn't really touched us yet. Not in London, not in our homes. That was all about to change. You see, by the summer of 1940, Hitler had conquered most of Western Europe. France had fallen. The British Army had barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving behind most of their equipment. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, and Hitler had a plan to invade England. It was called Operation Sea Lion. But first, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. They needed control of the skies. All through July and August, we'd hear about dogfights happening over the English Channel and the countryside. The Battle of Britain, they called it. Our brave RAF pilots fighting against impossible odds. We'd hear the stories on the radio. We'd see the newspapers. But we didn't see it. Not with our own eyes. Not yet. I remember one evening in late August. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework. Mum was darning socks. Dad was reading the newspaper, his face grim. The radio was on, and the news wasn't good. The announcer was talking about increased German bomber activity, about raids on coastal towns, about the possibility of attacks on London. They won't bomb London, Mum said, more to herself than to anyone else. They wouldn't dare bomb civilians. They wouldn't bomb children. Dad didn't say anything. He just folded his newspaper and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was fear. Pure, undisguised fear. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I'm going to reinforce the Anderson shelter in the back garden." I didn't understand what he meant. Not really. I thought it would be an adventure, sleeping in the shelter if the air raid sirens went off. I thought it might be exciting. I had no idea. None of us did. We had no idea that in less than 2 weeks, our entire world would be set on fire. We had no idea that the childhood we knew was about to end forever. September 7th, 1940. That was the day everything changed. That was the day the Blitz began. And I was about to learn what real fear felt like. Saturday, September 7th, 1940. It was a beautiful late summer day, the kind of day where the sun feels warm on your face and there's just the slightest hint of autumn in the air. I'd spent the afternoon playing with my friend Johnny from next door. We'd been pretending to be RAF pilots, running around with our arms out like wings, making engine noises and shooting down imaginary German bombers. If only we'd known. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we heard it. At first, it sounded like distant thunder, but the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. The sound got louder and louder, and then we saw them, wave after wave after wave of German bombers. Hundreds of them. They filled the sky, formation after formation, flying up the Thames towards London. The sound was overwhelming. It was like the entire world was shaking. I remember standing there, my mouth open, my pretend RAF pilot game forgotten, just staring up at this impossible sight. "Inside, now!" My father's voice. I'd never heard him shout like that. He was running towards me, grabbing my arm, pulling me towards our house. Other parents were doing the same all down the street, grabbing their children, shouting, running. And then the bombs started falling. Have you ever heard a bomb whistle as it falls? I hope you never do. It's a sound that starts high and drops lower and lower as it gets closer. And you don't know where it's going to land. You don't know if it's going to land on you. You just hear that whistle getting louder and you freeze. Your entire body locks up because there's nothing you can do. You're helpless. And then there's the explosion. The first one hit about 3 streets away. The ground shook. Our windows rattled. Pictures fell off the walls. I remember thinking, nonsensically, that Mum was going to be angry about the broken glass from the picture frames. The shelter. Dad was already pushing us towards the back door. Mum grabbed my little sister Elsie, who was only 4 and was screaming. I remember her face, white as a sheet, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't understand what was happening. She just knew everyone was scared, and that made her scared. Our Anderson shelter was at the bottom of our small back garden. If you don't know what an Anderson shelter was, let me explain. It was basically a curved sheet of corrugated iron half buried in the ground, with earth piled on top. 6 feet by 4 feet. Tiny. Dad had put bunk beds inside and tried to make it as comfortable as possible, but it was still just a hole in the ground covered in metal. We ran. Another whistle, another explosion. Closer this time. I could feel the blast wave hit my back. I stumbled, but Dad caught me, practically threw me into the shelter. Mum dove in with Elsie. Dad squeezed in behind us and pulled the door shut. And then we waited. In the darkness, listening to London being destroyed above us. That first raid lasted for hours. The bombers came in waves. First, the high-explosive bombs, designed to blow buildings apart. Then the incendiaries, thousands upon thousands of them, designed to set everything on fire. We could hear the explosions. Constant, never-ending. Sometimes close enough that dirt would fall from the roof of our shelter. Sometimes so close that the concussion would make your ears pop and your chest hurt. Elsie cried. Mum held her and sang to her, but Mum was crying too. Dad sat on the edge of one of the bunks, his hands clasped together, his head bowed. I realized later he was praying. I sat next to him, trying to be brave, trying not to show that I was terrified. I was 7 years old, and I was certain I was going to die. The smell in the shelter was awful. Damp earth, mildew, the chemical toilet in the corner, and fear. You could smell the fear. Sweat and adrenaline and terror. It's a smell I can still remember 85 years later. It's a smell that never really leaves you. At some point, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, it was quiet. The all-clear siren was sounding. Dad opened the shelter door, and we climbed out into a world that had changed forever. The sky was orange. Not the orange of a beautiful sunset, the orange of 1,000 fires burning across London. The East End and the docks were ablaze. You could see the flames from our back garden. Enormous columns of smoke rose into the sky, blotting out the stars, the smell of burning wood and something else, something chemical and wrong, filled the air. We walked around to the front of our house. Our street had been lucky. No direct hits. But 3 streets over, where that first bomb had landed, an entire row of houses was just gone, reduced to rubble. People were already out, digging through the wreckage with their bare hands, calling out names, looking for survivors. Mrs. Johnson from number 34 was sitting on what was left of her front step, just staring at nothing. Her house was still standing, but all the windows were blown out. Her hair, normally so carefully pinned up, was hanging loose. She looked like she'd aged 20 years in one night. Mr. Henderson, our milkman, was helping pull bricks away from a collapsed house. His hands were bleeding, but he didn't seem to notice. Someone had told him the Peterson family was trapped inside. He'd delivered milk to the Petersons every morning for 15 years. And then I saw Johnny's house. My friend Johnny, who I'd been playing with just hours earlier. His house had taken a direct hit. There was nothing left but a crater and a pile of bricks. Johnny's mum was there, being held back by 2 neighbors, screaming Johnny's name over and over. They found Johnny 3 days later, and his little brother, and his parents. None of them had made it to their shelter in time. I was 7 years old, and my best friend was dead. And I didn't understand how the world could do this, how adults could do this to each other, how someone had sat in an airplane thousands of feet above us and decided to drop bombs on houses where children were sleeping. I didn't understand, and in some ways, I still don't. But here's what I did understand. Even then, this wasn't over. This was just the beginning, and we were going to have to learn how to survive. We were going to have to become harder than children should ever have to be. Welcome to the Blitz. Welcome to my childhood. You want to know something strange? After that first night, after we'd seen what the Germans could do, we thought it couldn't possibly happen again. Not like that. Not night after night. That level of destruction, that level of terror, surely it was a one-time thing. Surely we were wrong. The bombs came back the next night, September 8th, and the night after that, and the night after that. For 57 consecutive nights, the German Luftwaffe bombed London. 57 nights without a break. Think about that for a moment. Almost 2 months where every single night, as the sun went down, we knew the bombs were coming. And we had to figure out how to live with that. Our Anderson shelter became our second home. Every evening, as it started to get dark, we'd gather our things. Blankets, pillows, books, a thermos of tea, some biscuits if we had them, the battery-powered radio, Elsie's doll, and we'd go sit in that damp, cold, tiny metal box in the ground and wait for the sirens. Sometimes the sirens would go off at 6 p.m., sometimes at 8. Sometimes we'd get lucky and have until 10, but they always came. You could set your watch by it. The Germans were nothing if not punctual. Mum tried to make it bearable. She'd bring homework for me to do by torchlight. She'd read stories to Elsie. Dad would tell us about when he was a boy, growing up in the countryside, trying to distract us from the sound of bombs falling. Sometimes, if the bombing wasn't too close, we'd play card games. Snap. Old Maid. Anything to pass the time. Anything to pretend this was normal, but it wasn't normal. How could it be normal when every few minutes there'd be an explosion that made the ground shake? When you could hear buildings collapsing, when you could hear, if you listened carefully, the screams of people who hadn't made it to shelter in time. Our Anderson shelter could fit us, barely. But not everyone had a shelter. Not everyone had a garden to put one in. So people improvised. They used their basements. They reinforced their cellars with timbers and sandbags. They hid under their stairs, which was supposedly the strongest part of a house. Some people, incredibly, stayed in their beds and took their chances. And then there were the public shelters, the tube stations, London's underground. When the Blitz started, the government didn't want people using the tube as shelters. They thought it would cause panic. They thought it would spread disease. They thought it would be bad for morale. But you know what happened? People just bought tickets and refused to leave. By the thousands. By the tens of thousands. The government gave up and made it official. The tube stations became the largest bomb shelters in London. Every evening, families would queue up at the stations, bringing blankets and supplies, and they'd camp out on the platforms until the all clear sounded. I remember going to Bethnal Green Tube Station with Mum and Elsie one night when our shelter got flooded from rain. It was chaos. Organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Families staking out their spots on the platform, children running between the groups, the smell of unwashed bodies and chemical toilets and food all mixed together. And underneath it all, the ever-present fear. But you know what else was there? Community. People looking out for each other, sharing what little food they had, helping with each other's children. Someone had brought a harmonica and was playing music. Someone else was leading sing-alongs. Old songs. Music hall songs. Pack up your troubles. It's a long way to Tipperary. Songs that let us feel like we were all in this together. And we were. That's the thing about the Blitz that people sometimes forget. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, it was traumatic. But it also brought people together in a way that nothing else could. When you're facing death together every night, differences don't matter much anymore. Rich or poor, conservative or liberal, it didn't matter. We were all in the same boat, all facing the same bombs. I made friends in those tube stations. Kids from other parts of London, other neighborhoods. We'd play together on the platforms while our parents tried to sleep or listen to the distant crumps of bombs falling above us. We'd trade stories about near misses, about the damage we'd seen, about who we knew who'd been killed. We were kids, but we were talking about death like it was a normal topic of conversation. Because for us, It was. I remember one little girl, Sarah was her name, who'd been in a house when a bomb hit the building next door. The blast had blown in all the windows, and a piece of glass had cut her face. She had this long scar across her cheek. She was 6 years old, and she wore that scar like a badge of honor. "I got this from a jerry bomb," she'd say proudly. I survived. We were children learning to be survivors. We were children learning to live with fear as a constant companion. We were children growing up too fast because we had no choice. But we were also still children. And children are remarkably resilient. We'd play games in the shelters. We'd tell jokes. We'd dare each other to peek outside during a raid just to see the searchlights. We'd collect shrapnel the morning after an air raid, comparing pieces like they were treasures, arguing about whether a chunk was from a German bomb or from British anti-aircraft shells. Looking back, it seems insane, traumatic, dangerous, and it was all of those things. But it was also our normal. This was our childhood. This was the world we knew, and we adapted because that's what humans do. We adapt, we survive. But the cost of that adaptation, the cost was paid in nightmares, in flinching at loud noises, in never quite feeling safe again, even decades later. Even now, even sitting here, 85 years later in a quiet room, part of me is still that 7-year-old boy in a shelter, listening to the bombs fall, wondering if tonight is the night my luck runs out. You never really leave the shelter. Not completely. Not in your head. You know what the strangest part of the Blitz was? It was the mornings. Every night London would be bombed. Buildings would be destroyed. People would die. The city would be set on fire. And then the sun would come up, and we'd have to pretend everything was normal. The all-clear siren would sound, usually around 5 or 6 in the morning. We'd climb out of our shelters, stiff and sore from sleeping on thin mattresses or wooden bunks. Our eyes would be gritty from lack of sleep. Our clothes would smell like damp earth and fear. And we'd emerge to see what the night had brought. Sometimes we'd be lucky. Our street would be untouched, the damage would be elsewhere, and we'd feel guilty relief that it was someone else's problem this time. Sometimes we wouldn't be so lucky. There'd be a new crater where a house used to be. A building cut in half, the interior rooms exposed like a dollhouse. Furniture hanging out of a third-floor bedroom that now had no wall. A bathtub suspended impossibly over empty air. But whatever the damage, whatever had happened during the night, the morning routine was the same. We had to get on with it. That was the phrase everyone used. Mustn't let Jerry win. Must get on with it. Dad would go off to work at the docks if the docks were still standing. Mum would make breakfast if we had food. I would get ready for school if the school was still there. Because that was the rule. Keep calm and carry on. Maintain normal life as much as possible. Don't let the Germans see that they're winning. Don't let them break your spirit. It sounds brave when I say it like that. And maybe it was brave. But it was also exhausting. It was going through the motions when every fiber of your being wanted to just curl up and cry. It was pretending to be normal when nothing was normal anymore. I remember walking to school one morning and having to take a detour because an entire street had been reduced to rubble during the night. The rescue workers were still there, digging. You could hear them calling for quiet every few minutes, listening for any sounds of survivors trapped beneath the bricks and timber. Everyone walking past would go silent, holding their breath, hoping, and then the digging would resume. School was strange. Half the kids would be absent, either because they'd been evacuated out of London or because they were helping their families deal with bomb damage or because they were dead. Miss Patterson would take attendance, and with each name that got no response, her face would get a little tighter, a little more pained. "Has anyone seen Bobby Williams?" she'd ask, and we'd shake our heads. Bobby's family had been in the same shelter we were in last week, but we hadn't seen them last night. Nobody had. We'd find out 2 days later that Bobby and his entire family had been killed when their Anderson shelter took a direct hit. 7 people, gone in an instant. Bobby was 8 years old. He'd let me borrow his cricket bat just the week before. Classes would continue. We'd do our maths lessons. We'd practice our reading. We'd learn about the kings and queens of England, which seemed absurdly irrelevant when we might not survive to the end of the week. But Miss Patterson carried on teaching, because that's what you did. You carried on. Lunchtime was always interesting. Our school had a canteen, but food was getting scarcer. Rationing had started even before the Blitz, but it got worse as the bombing continued. Ships couldn't get to the docks as easily. Storage warehouses were being destroyed. Distribution was disrupted. So our school lunches got smaller and smaller. More potatoes, more bread, less meat, less of everything, really. I remember one day, the lunch was literally just a boiled potato and some gravy. That was it, and we were grateful to have it. Because we knew that some kids whose homes had been destroyed, weren't getting even that. There were kids living in rest centers, temporary shelters set up for people who'd been bombed out of their homes, and they were surviving on tea and biscuits until more permanent arrangements could be made. After school, if there was time before the sirens started, we'd play. But our games had changed. We didn't play cowboys and Indians anymore. We played air raid wardens and bombers. We played rescue workers digging through rubble. We played Royal Air Force versus Luftwaffe. Our play had become a reflection of our reality because our reality was all we knew. And we'd go looking for souvenirs. Shrapnel was the most common jagged pieces of metal from exploded bombs or anti-aircraft shells. We'd compare pieces, argue about where they came from. Sometimes we'd find pieces of incendiary bombs, the magnesium canisters that the Germans dropped by the thousands to set fire. Those were real prizes. Once, I found a piece of what I was convinced was a German airplane. It was a twisted chunk of metal with some rivets and what looked like part of a letter painted on it. I kept it for years, this tangible proof that the enemy was real, that they could be shot down, that we were fighting back. Looking back, it was probably just a piece of somebody's roof. But at the time, it was treasure. It was hope. The ARP wardens, the air raid precautions wardens, would shoo us away from bomb sites. Clear off, you lot. Dangerous here. But we'd always come back. We were kids. We were curious. And in some strange way, the destruction was fascinating. You couldn't help but stare at a building that had been sliced perfectly in half, at a car that had been thrown onto a rooftop by the force of a blast, at a bus that was now sitting in a crater. I remember one evening, just before the siren started, standing with my dad looking at what used to be the corner shop where Mum bought our groceries. It was completely gone, just a pile of bricks and splintered wood. Mr. and Mrs. Cohen, who'd run that shop for 30 years, had been killed in the blast, along with 2 customers who'd had the bad luck to be shopping when the bomb hit. Why? I asked my dad. Why are they doing this to us? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because war makes people do terrible things. Because Hitler wants us to give up, to surrender. Because he thinks if he kills enough of us, we'll lose our will to fight. Will we? I asked. Will we give up? Dad looked down at me, and I saw something in his eyes. Not just sadness, not just fear, but determination, anger, defiance. No, he said. No, we bloody well will not. We'll take everything they throw at us, and we'll still be standing. Because we're Londoners, and Londoners don't quit. At the time, I believed him completely. It sounded brave and strong and true. Now looking back, I can hear the desperation in his words. The need to believe it himself, the need to give his son something to hold on to, because the truth was, none of us knew if we'd be standing at the end of this. None of us knew if we'd even survive the week. But we pretended. We pretended we were brave. We pretended we weren't terrified. We pretended that life was normal. And maybe that pretending was a kind of bravery in itself. Maybe carrying on in the face of overwhelming fear is the truest courage there is. Or maybe we just didn't have a choice. December 29th, 1940. If you know anything about the Blitz, you probably know about this date. It's the night the Germans tried to burn London to the ground. They very nearly succeeded. By late December, we'd been living with the bombing for almost 4 months. We'd developed routines. We'd learned the difference between the sounds of different types of bombs. We could tell by the sound of the anti-aircraft guns whether the German bombers were close or far away. We'd become experts at survival, but we'd also become complacent. That's dangerous in wartime. You start to think, well, we've survived this long. We know what we're doing. We'll be fine. You start to feel like you've got it figured out. The Germans were about to remind us that we had figured out nothing. It was a Sunday night. A lot of people were away for the Christmas holidays, or what passed for holidays during the Blitz. The city was quieter than usual. The financial district, the City of London, was almost empty. Just a few fire watchers on duty on the roofs of buildings. That was their job, to watch for incendiary bombs and put them out before they could start major fires. There weren't enough of them. Not nearly enough. The raid started around 6:15 p.m. But this wasn't like other raids. This time, the Germans weren't dropping many high-explosive bombs. Instead, they were dropping incendiaries. Tens of thousands of incendiaries, small magnesium fire bombs designed to set everything ablaze. They fell like rain, like deadly rain that burned at 2,000 degrees. We were in our shelter, as usual. But even from underground, we could tell something was different. The explosions weren't as loud as usual, but there was a roaring sound, a crackling, and the air that seeped into our shelter was hot, unnaturally hot, and filled with smoke. Dad kept opening the shelter door slightly, peeking out, then closing it again. Each time he opened it, the orange glow from outside got brighter. The air got hotter. Finally, around 9 p.m., he turned to us with fear written all over his face. "We need to get out of here," he said. "The fire's getting too close." Mum clutched Elsie tighter. "Out? Out where? Into the bombs?" "If we stay here, we'll roast alive," Dad said. "The fire's going to suck all the oxygen out of the air. We need to move. Now." I'd never seen my father so frightened. This was a man who'd stayed calm through months of bombing, but now his hands were shaking as he gathered up our emergency bags. We climbed out of the shelter, and I stepped into hell. The entire horizon was burning. In every direction, massive fires lit up the night sky. It was brighter than daylight. The heat was incredible, like opening an oven and sticking your head inside. The air was thick with smoke and ash. Bits of burning paper and fabric floated through the air like deadly snow. St. Paul's Cathedral, about 2 miles away in the city, stood out against the flames. I could see it clearly, its dome dark against the wall of fire behind it. It looked like it was standing in the middle of the apocalypse. And maybe it was. "Come on!" Dad grabbed my hand and started pulling me down the street. We were heading for the tube station, the only shelter deep enough to be safe from the firestorm that was consuming London. The streets were chaos. People were running in every direction, carrying whatever they'd been able to grab. Some were pulling handcarts loaded with belongings. Others just had the clothes on their backs. Everyone's faces were lit by the orange glow of the fires, and everyone's eyes held the same expression: pure terror. We ran past buildings that were already burning. The heat was so intense you couldn't get within 30 feet of them. We ran past firefighters who were trying desperately to contain the blazes, but there were too many fires and not enough water. The water mains had been damaged by bombs. The Thames was at low tide, making it hard to pump water. The firefighters were losing the battle. I remember seeing one fireman sitting on the curb, his face black with soot, crying. Just openly crying, because he couldn't save the city. Nobody could. London was burning, and all we could do was run. A wall collapsed as we ran past it, sending up a shower of sparks and a blast of heat that nearly knocked me off my feet. Dad yanked me upright and kept running. Elsie was screaming, Mum was praying out loud, and all around us, London burned. We made it to the tube station, Bethnal Green. There were hundreds of people there, all with the same idea. Safety underground. Away from the firestorm. The platforms were packed. People were sitting on the stairs. There was barely room to breathe. But we were safe. Relatively. We stayed there all night. We could hear the bombs above us, but they sounded distant. Muted. What we couldn't hear was the fire. But we knew it was up there. Consuming everything. Destroying our city. When the all clear finally sounded and we emerged the next morning, the sun was barely visible through the smoke. The air was thick and grey. Ash covered everything like snow. And the smell. God, the smell. Burning wood, burning rubber, burning chemicals, and underneath it all, something else. Something I didn't recognize then, but I know now was the smell of burning flesh. Our street had survived. Our house was still standing. But when we walked to the top of our road and looked towards the city, towards central London, all we could see was devastation. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to smoking rubble. The fires were still burning, would keep burning for days. Over 1,500 fires had been started that night. The Germans had dropped more than 100,000 incendiary bombs. 19 churches were destroyed. 16 hospitals were hit. And yet, miraculously, St. Paul's Cathedral still stood. Firefighters had worked through the night to save it, and they succeeded. That dome, standing defiant against the flames, became a symbol that London would not be broken, but the cost was devastating. Hundreds of people died that night. Thousands were left homeless. Centuries of history went up in smoke. Ancient churches, historic buildings, irreplaceable archives and libraries, all gone. I was 7 years old, and I'd witnessed a firestorm. I'd seen my city nearly burn to the ground. I'd felt heat so intense it felt like it would melt your eyeballs. I'd breathed smoke so thick you couldn't see 5 feet in front of you. And the worst part, the very worst part, this wasn't the end. The Germans kept bombing us, night after night after night. The firestorm of December 29th was just one particularly bad night in a campaign of terror that would continue for months. How do you process that as a child? How do you make sense of it? The answer is, you don't. You just survive. You just keep putting one foot in front of the other. You just keep hoping that maybe tonight the bombs won't fall, but they always did. Let me tell you about the ordinary things. Because it's easy to talk about bombs and fires and death. But life during the Blitz wasn't just about the dramatic moments. It was about the slow, grinding difficulty of everyday existence. It was about trying to live a normal life when nothing was normal. Food, for example. Do you know what it's like to be genuinely hungry? Not I skipped lunch and I'm peckish hungry, but deep, gnawing, constant hunger. Because that was a huge part of the Blitz experience, especially for us kids who were still growing and needed more food than there was available. Rationing had started in January 1940, before the Blitz even began. Every person got a ration book with coupons for different foods. Butter, sugar, meat, tea, cheese, eggs. You could only buy what your coupons allowed, no matter how much money you had. The idea was to make sure everyone got a fair share. But as the Blitz went on, and more ships were sunk by German U-boats, and more warehouses were destroyed by bombs, the rations got smaller. By late 1940, an adult's weekly ration was about 4 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, 8 ounces of sugar, and meat to the value of about 1 shilling and 6pence. That might sound like enough if you're not familiar with rationing, but trust me, it wasn't. Mum became a genius at stretching meals. She'd make soup from vegetable peelings. She'd use every part of every ingredient. Nothing was wasted, ever. Bread crusts that went stale became breadcrumbs. Bones from the tiny amount of meat we got became stock for soup. Even potato peelings could be fried up for a crispy snack if you had a tiny bit of fat to cook them in. I remember the day Mum traded her wedding ring for food. We'd had a particularly bad week. Dad's work at the docks had been interrupted by bomb damage, so he'd lost several days of pay. We'd run out of almost everything. Elsie was crying from hunger, and Mum took off her wedding ring, the ring Dad had given her when they got married, and she traded it to a black market dealer for a small ham, some eggs, and a bag of potatoes. She cried while she cooked that food. Cried while we ate it, but we ate it. Because we needed to. Because when it comes down to survival, a ring is just a piece of metal, but food is life. The black market was huge during the Blitz. Officially, it was illegal. Officially, everyone was supposed to stick to their rations and make do. But in reality, if you knew the right people, if you had something to trade, you could get things. Not easily. Not cheaply. But you could get them. Dad knew a man at the docks who could sometimes get hold of oranges or bananas from ships that had made it through the U-boat patrols. Incredibly rare. Incredibly expensive. But on special occasions, if we'd been very good, he'd bring home an orange. One orange that the four of us would share, and it was the most delicious thing in the world. I didn't taste chocolate from September 1940 until well after the war ended. Can you imagine that? Years without chocolate. That's what it was like. All the little treats and luxuries that you probably take for granted just didn't exist for us. And clothing was another problem. Everything was rationed. You got coupons for clothes just like you got coupons for food. But clothes wore out. Kids grew, and you couldn't just go buy new things. My school clothes got patches on the patches. Mum would darn my socks until there was more darning than sock. When I grew out of my shoes, Dad would cut the toes out to give my feet more room, and I'd wear them like that until we'd saved up enough coupons for new ones. In winter, with snow on the ground, with my toes sticking out. My coat had belonged to a cousin who'd outgrown it. Elsie's dresses were made from old curtains or from unpicking adult clothes and remaking them into child-sized ones. Nothing was new. Nothing was wasted. Everything was reused and repurposed until it literally fell apart. And then there was school. School became increasingly difficult as the Blitz went on. Not just because we were all exhausted from spending nights in shelters. Not just because we were hungry, but because the schools themselves kept getting bombed. My school, St. Mary's, got hit in November. Not destroyed completely, thank God, but damaged enough that we couldn't use it anymore. So we got combined with another school that was still standing. 2 schools worth of students, sharing one building. We went in shifts, the younger kids in the morning, the older kids in the afternoon. Half days of education. Miss Patterson did her best, but it was impossible to really teach properly when half the class was falling asleep from exhaustion and the other half was so hungry they couldn't concentrate. Books became precious. If your school books got destroyed in a bombing, there weren't replacements. You shared, you borrowed, you memorized because you might not have the book tomorrow. I remember copying out entire passages from textbooks by hand, because I was afraid the book would be destroyed before I'd finished studying it. And toys. Forget it. The toys we had were it. There were no toy shops open, no factories making toys when all the factories were busy making weapons and ammunition. If you broke a toy, it stayed broken. If you lost a toy in a bombing, it was gone forever. We learned to be very, very careful with our possessions. But you know what we did have? We had our imaginations. We played elaborate games that required nothing but our creativity. We told each other stories. We made up songs. We invented games with whatever materials we could find. Bits of rubble became building blocks. Sticks became swords. Imagination was free and the government couldn't ration it. I think that's something people don't always understand about the Blitz. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, it was traumatic. But life went on. We still played. We still laughed. We still found moments of joy in the midst of the horror. Because if we hadn't, If we'd just given in to the fear and the misery, then Hitler would have won. And we weren't going to let that happen. But there were things we lost that we could never get back. Not objects, not food, but parts of our childhood, our innocence, our sense of safety, our belief that adults could protect us and keep us safe. I lost my best friend Johnny. I lost countless neighbors and classmates. I lost my grandfather when he had a heart attack during a raid and the ambulance couldn't get through the rubble-strewn streets in time. I lost my sense that home was a safe place. I lost the ability to sleep without startling awake at every unexpected sound. Every child who lived through the Blitz lost something. Some lost more than others. Some lost everything. But we all lost our childhoods. We all grew up too fast. We all learned about death and destruction and human cruelty at an age when we should have been learning about arithmetic and playing hopscotch. And we carried those losses with us for the rest of our lives. Some of us coped better than others. Some of us fell apart. Some of us spent decades in therapy. Some of us never talked about it at all, just locked it away and tried to pretend it never happened. I'm talking about it now because I think it's important. I think people need to know what war really does. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic narrative, but the real, gritty, day-to-day misery of it. The hunger, the fear, the loss, the way it takes children and forces them to become survivors before they've even learned to be people. That's the real cost of war. And it's a cost that gets paid long after the last bomb falls. I want to talk about the heroes. Not the kind you see in movies. Not the pilots with their medals or the generals with their strategies. I want to talk about the ordinary people who kept London alive during the Blitz, because they were the real heroes. They were the ones who saved us. Let me tell you about Mr. Davies. He was our ARP warden, our air raid precautions warden. A short, stocky man in his 50s with a bad leg from the First World War. He couldn't serve in the military this time around, but by God, he was going to serve his community. Every night during the raids, Mr. Davies would be out on the streets, wearing his tin helmet with ARP painted on it, carrying his gas mask, checking that everyone was in their shelters, making sure the blackout was being observed, that no lights were showing to guide German bombers, putting out small fires before they could spread, helping dig people out of collapsed buildings. He had no special training. He had no special equipment. He was just a middle-aged man with a limp, doing his bit, and he saved countless lives. I know he saved ours at least once. It was a night in October. A bomb had hit the house at the end of our street, and the blast had caused our chimney to collapse. Part of it had fallen through the roof and into our attic. We didn't know it from inside our shelter, but our house was on fire. The chimney bricks had been red hot, and they'd set the attic timbers alight. Mr. Davies spotted the smoke. He ran to our shelter, pounded on the door. "Out, out now! Your house is ablaze!" We got out with seconds to spare. By the time the fire brigade arrived, our attic was fully engulfed. If Mr. Davies hadn't been making his rounds, if he hadn't been watching, we'd have stayed in that shelter and died from smoke inhalation. He didn't want thanks. He just tipped his helmet, said, "All in a night's work," and moved on to check the next house. That was Mr. Davies. That was the kind of man he was. And then there were the firefighters. Have you ever thought about what it must have been like to be a firefighter during the Blitz? Running towards danger while everyone else was running away. Fighting fires while bombs were still falling. Trying to save buildings when you knew that at any moment a bomb could land on you. The fire brigade was a mixture of professionals and volunteers, men and women who'd signed up to help. They worked shifts that lasted 24 hours or more. They'd fight one fire, then immediately get called to another, and another, and another. They were exhausted, hungry, sometimes injured, and they kept going. I remember watching firefighters battle a blaze in a warehouse near the docks. The building was fully involved, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, and these men were right there, playing water on it, trying to contain it. Bombs were falling around them. One landed close enough that the blast knocked them off their feet. They got up, picked up their hoses, and kept fighting the fire. Why? Why would anyone do that? Why would you risk your life to save a building that's probably already doomed? Because it wasn't about the building. It was about stopping the fire from spreading. It was about protecting the buildings next door, the ones that could still be saved. It was about not letting the Germans win. It was about doing your job, doing your duty, even when it was terrifying, even when it seemed hopeless. Hundreds of firefighters died during the Blitz. They were buried under collapsed buildings. They were hit by bombs. They died from smoke inhalation or from sheer exhaustion. They died heroes, every single one of them, and the doctors and nurses, the medical staff who worked through the raids, treating the injured even as bombs fell around their hospitals, performing surgery by candlelight when the power went out, comforting the dying, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, saving who they could and mourning those they couldn't. My little sister Elsie got a cut on her leg from some broken glass during a raid. It got infected. This was before antibiotics were widely available, so an infected cut was serious. Really serious. Mum took her to the hospital, terrified that she might lose her baby girl to something as simple as an infection. The nurse who treated Elsie was named Margaret. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old. She cleaned the wound. She applied iodine, which made Elsie scream. She bandaged it carefully. And then she sat with Mum and explained exactly how to care for it, how to watch for signs that the infection was spreading, what to do if it got worse. She did all this in a hospital ward where half the windows were blown out, where you could hear bombs falling outside, where there were far more patients than beds. She did her job with patience and kindness and competence, and Elsie recovered. I saw Nurse Margaret several more times over the course of the Blitz. She was always there, always working, always kind. I learned later that she worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, that she slept in the hospital basement on a cot, that her own home had been destroyed in a bombing, but she kept working because people needed her. That's heroism. Real, unglamorous, exhausting heroism. And what about the teachers like Miss Patterson, the ones who kept schools running despite everything, who taught children who were traumatized and exhausted and hungry, who provided some semblance of normalcy when nothing was normal? Miss Patterson kept a box of treats in her desk. Nothing much, some boiled sweets when she could get them, some biscuits, and if she noticed a child who looked particularly hungry or upset, she'd quietly slip them something. Technically, she should have kept to her rations like everyone else, but she shared what little she had because she cared about us, because she knew we needed more than just lessons in arithmetic. We needed to know that someone cared. She never married Miss Patterson. She dedicated her life to teaching, and I'll bet she touched hundreds of lives over her career, hundreds of children who remembered the kind teacher who helped them through the Blitz, and my own parents, my dad, who went to work every day even though the docks were constantly being bombed, who came home exhausted and afraid, but who still tried to make us feel safe. My mum, who rationed food so carefully that she often went hungry to make sure Elsie and I had enough, who sang to us in the shelter, who held us when we cried, who was strong when she must have been terrified. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They weren't in the history books. They didn't get medals. They just did what needed to be done because someone had to do it. That's what I want people to understand about the Blitz. It wasn't just about Churchill's speeches or the RAF pilots or the famous moments. It was about millions of ordinary people choosing to keep going, choosing to help each other, choosing to not give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier. Every person who showed up to work during the Blitz was a hero. Every person who volunteered to be an ARP warden or a firefighter or a nurse was a hero. Every parent who kept their children safe. Every teacher who kept teaching. Every shopkeeper who stayed open despite the danger. Every person who just kept living their life in defiance of Hitler's bombs was a hero. They were the ones who won the Blitz. Not through any one grand gesture, but through thousands of small acts of courage and kindness and determination. They were the ones who proved that you can't break the human spirit with bombs. You can't destroy hope with fire. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's this. In times of darkness, look for the helpers. Look for the people who keep showing up, because they're always there. They're the ones who keep the world turning when everything feels like it's falling apart. They were there during the Blitz. And they're here now, wherever you are, whatever challenges you're facing. The teachers, the nurses, the ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The heroes who never make headlines. They saved us then, and people like them are saving us now. Never forget that. May 1941. We didn't know it at the time, but the end was coming. The end of the nightly bombings, the end of the most intense period of the Blitz. But before it ended, the Germans had one more massive attack planned. One final attempt to break London's spirit. The night of May 10th, 1941. It was the worst raid of the entire Blitz. Worse than the first night. Worse than the firestorm in December. Worse than anything we'd experienced. Over 500 German bombers came that night. They dropped more than 700 tons of high-explosive bombs and thousands upon thousands of incendiaries. The attack lasted for hours, from before sunset until nearly dawn. Wave after wave after wave. I remember it clearly. We were in our shelter, as always. But this night felt different. The bombing was more intense, more sustained. The ground shook constantly. The air in our shelter was thick with dust that kept filtering in. We could hear buildings collapsing, explosions that were so close they made our ears ring. And through it all, the sound of German engines overhead. They just kept coming. Dad had stopped pretending to be calm. He sat with his head in his hands. Mum held Elsie and me close, rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless melody that I think she didn't even realize she was making. We were all convinced this was it. This was the night we were going to die. The House of Commons was hit that night. Destroyed. Westminster Abbey was damaged. The British Museum was hit. Over 1,400 people were killed. More than 1,700 were seriously injured, and this was after 8 months of constant bombing. 8 months of destruction, 8 months of death. And it was still getting worse. When we finally emerged the next morning, London looked like the end of the world. Smoke hung over everything. Fires were still burning. The smell of destruction was overwhelming. Water from burst mains was flooding some streets. Gas from broken gas lines was leaking, creating the risk of explosions. Power lines were down. The city's infrastructure was devastated. We stood outside our shelter, and I remember thinking, how can we survive this? How can anyone survive this? We were beaten, exhausted, traumatized. Surely this was the end. But it wasn't. We kept going, because that's what we did. That's what we'd learned to do over 8 months of nightly bombing. You survive, you pick up the pieces, you carry on. And then, something strange happened. The next night we waited for the sirens, but they didn't come. Not that night, not the night after. Days passed, then weeks, and gradually, slowly, we realized that something had changed. The Blitz was over. We didn't know why at the time. We learned later that Hitler had turned his attention east, towards the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, was about to begin. The Luftwaffe was being redeployed. The bombers that had terrorized London for 8 months were needed elsewhere. We'd survived. We'd actually survived. After 57 consecutive nights of bombing, after months more of regular raids, after over 43,000 civilians killed and over 1 million homes destroyed, we were still here. London was still here. The relief was overwhelming, but so was something else, a kind of numbness. We'd been living with constant fear for so long that we didn't know how to feel safe anymore. For weeks after the raid stopped, I'd still tense up every evening as it got dark, waiting for the sirens that didn't come. I'd have trouble sleeping because the silence felt wrong, unnatural. Other kids I knew felt the same way. We'd become so accustomed to danger that peace felt strange. We'd been living in survival mode for so long that we didn't know how to live normally anymore. And the city itself. London was a wreck. Entire neighborhoods were just rubble. There were bombed-out buildings everywhere you looked. Over 1 million people had been made homeless at various points during the Blitz. Families were living in rest centers, in communal shelters, squeezed into friends' and relatives' homes, anywhere they could find space. The recovery was slow. It took years. Some parts of London weren't fully rebuilt until the 1960s or even later. If you go to London today, you can still see the effects of the Blitz. Modern buildings sitting next to Victorian ones, because the ones that were between them were destroyed and had to be rebuilt. Gaps in rows of houses, new churches built where old ones were bombed. The scars are still there if you know where to look, but we survived. That's the important thing. We survived. Hitler tried to bomb us into submission, and we refused to submit. We took everything he threw at us, and we were still standing. People talk about the Blitz spirit, this idea that Londoners all pulled together, stayed cheerful, never complained. And there's some truth to that. We did pull together. We did help each other. We did refuse to give up. But the Blitz spirit narrative leaves out a lot. It leaves out the fear, the exhaustion, the tension, the looters who stole from bombed-out houses, the black marketeers who profited from scarcity, the people who broke under the strain, the fights over shelter space, the accusations and resentments, the sheer grinding misery of it all. We weren't saints. We were human beings under incredible stress, and we reacted like human beings. Most of us did our best. Some of us did better than that. Some of us failed, but all of us were scarred by the experience. I was 8 years old when the Blitz ended. 8 years old, and I'd seen more death and destruction than most people see in a lifetime. I'd lost friends. I'd lost innocence. I'd lost any sense that the world was a safe, predictable place. The war continued, of course. The Blitz was just one chapter. The fighting went on for 4 more years. But for London, for those of us who'd survived the Blitz, the worst was over. There would be later attacks, the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets in 1944 and 1945. But nothing like the sustained night-after-night terror of the Blitz. We'd survived. We'd won that battle. Not through any great military victory, but simply by refusing to break. By keeping on, by surviving. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Blitz. Maybe it's not about British stoicism or national character or any of that. Maybe it's just about the fact that humans are incredibly resilient, that we can survive things that seem unsurvivable, that we can keep going even when it seems impossible. We survived the Blitz. All of us who were there, all of us who lived through it, we carried scars, physical and emotional. We carried trauma. We carried losses that could never be recovered. But we survived, and we made sure that our children and their children would never have to go through what we went through. That's our legacy, not just that we survived, but that we worked to build a world where future generations wouldn't have to. The bombs stopped, but the war in my head continued for decades. That's what people don't tell you about trauma. It doesn't end when the danger ends. Sometimes it's only just beginning. I grew up. Of course I did. I became a teenager, then a young man. The war ended in 1945. I was 12 years old, and we celebrated in the streets. Everyone was hugging and crying and laughing. We'd won. After 6 years of war, we'd actually won. But I couldn't feel it. Not really. Part of me was still that 7-year-old boy in the shelter, listening to bombs fall. Part of me always would be. I had nightmares for years. Decades, actually. I'd dream I was back in the shelter, but this time the bomb had my name on it. This time I couldn't get out. This time my family was gone and I was alone in the darkness, listening to the world end above me. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, convinced I could hear air raid sirens. Loud noises would make me flinch. Fireworks were torture. I'd be right back there, 7 years old, terrified, waiting to die. Even thunder, even a car backfiring. My body would react before my brain could catch up, flooding with adrenaline, preparing for danger that wasn't there anymore. I struggled in school after the war. I'd missed so much education during the Blitz. We all had. And the trauma made it hard to concentrate. I'd be sitting in class, trying to focus on algebra or history, and suddenly I'd be somewhere else. Back in 1940. Back in the fire and fear. They didn't have a name for it then, PTSD. They just called it shell shock, if they called it anything at all. Mostly, they expected you to just get over it. So I tried. I tried to be normal. I got a job when I was old enough. I met a girl. I got married. I had children of my own. And all the time I was carrying this weight, this darkness, these memories that wouldn't leave me alone. I was an overprotective parent. I see that now. My kids couldn't understand why I'd panic if they were 5 minutes late coming home. Why I'd check and double-check locks on doors and windows. Why I always needed to know where the nearest exit was. Why I couldn't stand to be in crowded, enclosed spaces. They thought I was strange, controlling, paranoid. I was, but not because I wanted to be. Because I'd learned at age 7 that the world was dangerous, that safety was an illusion, that death could come from the sky at any moment and there was nothing you could do to stop it. My wife tried to understand. She really did. But how could she? She'd been evacuated to the countryside before the Blitz started. She'd spent the war years in relative safety. She'd never heard that whistle of a falling bomb. She'd never smelled burning flesh. She'd never wondered if tonight was the night she'd die. I didn't talk about it much. None of us did, my generation. The ones who'd been children during the Blitz. We'd been told to carry on, to be brave, to not make a fuss. And that lesson had been learned so thoroughly that we couldn't unlearn it. We buried our trauma deep and tried to pretend it wasn't there. But it was there. Always there. Affecting everything we did, every decision we made, every relationship we had. We were damaged goods, trying to pass as normal. Some of my childhood friends from the Blitz ended up in mental institutions. The trauma broke them. Others turned to alcohol, trying to drown the memories. Some became very successful, driven by a need to prove they'd survived for a reason, that their survival meant something. Others drifted through life, never quite able to engage fully because part of them was still stuck in 1940. I was somewhere in the middle. I functioned. I held down a job. I raised my family. But I was never quite whole. There was always this piece of me missing, lost somewhere in the rubble of wartime London. It wasn't until I was in my 60s that I finally sought help. Therapy, counseling. I'd retired, and suddenly I had time. Time to think. Time to remember, and the memories were overwhelming. My wife insisted I talk to someone. The therapist, a young woman who'd been born decades after the war, listened to my stories. And do you know what she said? She said I was suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. She said what had happened to me and thousands of other children during the Blitz was traumatic. She said it was okay to have been affected by it. She said I wasn't weak, I wasn't broken. I was a survivor of trauma. It was the first time in my life that anyone had acknowledged that what I'd been through was terrible, that it had effects, that those effects were legitimate. I cried in that office. At 65 years old, I cried like a child. All the tears I'd been holding back for nearly 60 years came pouring out. Therapy helped. Talking helped. Finally being able to say, I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a long time. That helped. I learned coping mechanisms. I learned that my reactions weren't crazy. They were my brain's way of trying to protect me from a danger that no longer existed. But I never fully recovered. How could I? Those experiences, those months of terror, they shaped me. They made me who I am. For better or worse, I'm a product of the Blitz as much as I am a product of my parents, my education, my choices. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I survived the Blitz itself. I survived the aftermath. I lived a reasonably good life. I have children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren now. I got to grow old, which is something Johnny and Bobby and Sarah and so many others never got to do. But there's a cost. There's always a cost, and the cost of surviving the Blitz was paid in nightmares and panic attacks and a lifelong inability to ever feel truly safe. It was paid in missed opportunities because I was too afraid to take risks. It was paid in relationships that suffered because I couldn't fully let people in. It was paid in a constant, low-level anxiety that I've carried with me for 85 years. War doesn't just kill the people it kills. It damages the people who survive. It echoes down through generations. My children grew up with a father who was loving but distant, protective but paranoid. That affected them. They've had their own struggles because of it, and I hate that. I hate that Hitler's bombs are still causing pain generations later. But that's war. That's what war really does. It doesn't just destroy buildings and kill soldiers. It destroys childhoods. It creates trauma that lasts lifetimes. It ripples forward through the years, affecting people who weren't even born when the bombs fell. I'm 92 years old now. The Blitz happened 85 years ago, but some nights I still wake up hearing the sirens. Some days I still flinch at unexpected sounds. Some moments I'm still that terrified 7-year-old boy, wondering if he's going to live to see morning. The Blitz ended in 1941. But for those of us who lived through it, it never really ended. Not completely. We just learned to live with it. We learned to carry it with us. We learned to survive, not just the bombs themselves, but the aftermath. The long, difficult, painful aftermath. And maybe that's the real story of the Blitz. Not the heroic narrative of British resilience, not the propaganda about keeping calm and carrying on, but the story of ordinary people, many of them children, who experienced something terrible and then had to spend the rest of their lives learning to live with what they'd experienced. We survived. But survival came with a price, and that price is paid not just by the survivors themselves, but by everyone they love, everyone they touch, everyone who comes after. That's the legacy of war. That's what we need to remember. Not just the dates and the statistics and the famous moments, but the human cost, the psychological cost, the cost that continues long after the last bomb falls. So here I am, 92 years old. More life behind me than ahead of me. And I'm telling you this story not because I want sympathy, not because I want to be seen as some kind of hero, but because I think it's important. I think people need to know what war really is, what it really does, especially now when the world feels uncertain again, when conflicts are flaring up around the globe, when the lessons of history seem to be forgotten with each new generation. Let me tell you what I learned from the Blitz, what I want you to understand, what I desperately hope you'll remember. First, war is not glorious. I know how it's portrayed in movies and video games. Heroic soldiers, brave sacrifices, victory and honor. And yes, there were heroes. There were brave people. But the reality of war, especially for civilians, especially for children, is terror and hunger and loss and trauma. It's watching your friends die. It's sleeping in a damp hole in the ground. It's being hungry all the time. It's having nightmares for the rest of your life. If there's any glory in war, it's despite the horror, not because of it. It's in the small acts of kindness and courage, not in the violence itself. The firefighters running towards burning buildings, the ARP wardens checking on their neighbors, the mothers keeping their children calm in shelters. That's where you find honor. not in the bombs, not in the destruction. Second, the people who pay the highest price in war are the ones who have nothing to do with starting it. My friends and I, we were 7 years old. We had no say in politics or international relations. We didn't vote for war. We didn't create the circumstances that led to war, but we paid for it. We paid with our childhoods. We paid with our innocence. We paid with our mental health. Some of us paid with our lives. When politicians talk about military action, when leaders rattle sabers and make threats, remember that. Remember that the people who will suffer most are children, our families, our ordinary people who just want to live their lives in peace. War is not an abstract concept. It's real suffering inflicted on real people. Third, humans are both terrible and wonderful. During the Blitz, I saw the worst of humanity. I saw the results of hatred and violence and the desire to dominate. I saw what happens when we dehumanize others, when we decide that some lives matter less than others, when we're willing to drop bombs on civilians to achieve political goals. But I also saw the best of humanity. I saw people helping each other, sharing what little they had, risking their lives for strangers, refusing to give up, refusing to let hatred win. I saw ordinary people become heroes simply by showing up and doing what needed to be done. We have the capacity for both, for incredible cruelty and incredible compassion. And which one we choose, both as individuals and as societies, that determines what kind of world we create. Fourth, trauma is real and it matters. For decades, I thought there was something wrong with me because I couldn't just get over the Blitz, because I still had nightmares, because I still reacted to loud noises, because I couldn't feel safe. I thought I was weak. I thought I should be able to move past it. But trauma doesn't work that way. Experiencing terrible things, especially as a child, changes you. It changes your brain. It changes how you see the world. And that's not weakness. That's being human. That's your brain trying to protect you from future danger. If you've experienced trauma, please get help. Please talk to someone. Please don't do what I did and suffer in silence for decades. There's no shame in being affected by traumatic experiences. The shame is in a society that doesn't provide support for trauma survivors. That expects people to just get over it and carry on. Fifth, peace is precious. We take it for granted, those of us lucky enough to live in peaceful times and places. We think it's normal. We think it's guaranteed. But it's not. Peace is fragile. It has to be worked for. It has to be maintained. It can disappear overnight. I know what it's like to live without peace. I know what it's like to go to bed every night wondering if you'll survive until morning. I know what it's like to live in constant fear. And I'm telling you, there is nothing more valuable than peace, than knowing you're safe, than knowing your children are safe. Don't take it for granted. Work to maintain it. Demand it from your leaders. Push back against those who would choose violence over diplomacy. Because once peace is gone, it's incredibly hard to get back. And the cost of losing it is paid by the most vulnerable among us. Sixth, remember the individuals behind the statistics. 43,000 civilians were killed in the Blitz. That's a number. It's a statistic in a history book. But every single one of those 43,000 people was a person. They had names, they had families. They had hopes and dreams and favorite foods and people they loved. They had lives that mattered. Johnny was my best friend. He loved cricket. He was learning to play the harmonica. He had a gap between his front teeth and a laugh that made everyone else laugh. He was 8 years old when he died. He's part of that statistic. But he was so much more than that. When you hear about casualties, about deaths in conflicts, remember that. Remember that these aren't just numbers. They're people. They're someone's Johnny, someone's child or parent or friend. They matter. Each and every one of them matters. Seventh, tell your story. I waited too long to talk about my experiences. I kept it all locked inside for decades, and it nearly broke me. But when I finally started talking, when I finally started sharing my story, something amazing happened. Other survivors reached out to me, people who'd had similar experiences, and we found comfort in knowing we weren't alone. If you've been through something difficult, something traumatic, consider sharing your story, not because you have to, not because you owe it to anyone, but because your story might help someone else, because your experience, your survival, might give hope to someone who's struggling, because stories connect us, they remind us that we're not alone. And finally, choose kindness. The world can be cruel. Terrible things happen. People hurt each other, but you have a choice. In every interaction, every decision, every moment, you can choose kindness. You can choose compassion. You can choose to make things a little bit better instead of a little bit worse. During the Blitz, the acts of kindness I experienced kept me going. The teacher who shared her treats, the nurse who took time to comfort my mother, the neighbor who checked on us after raids, Mr. Davies, our ARP warden, who saved our lives. These small acts of kindness in the midst of so much cruelty and destruction, these are what I remember most vividly. These are what gave me hope. You might not think you can make a difference. You might think your actions don't matter in the face of the world's problems. But they do. They absolutely do. Every act of kindness ripples outward. Every compassionate choice makes the world a little bit better. Every time you choose to help instead of hurt, to build instead of destroy, to love instead of hate, you're making a difference. I survived the Blitz. I survived the aftermath. I've lived a long life, and looking back, what I'm most grateful for aren't the big moments or the dramatic events. I'm grateful for the kindnesses I received. I'm grateful for the people who chose to be good when it would have been easier to be selfish. I'm grateful for the small acts of humanity that proved we were still human, even in the midst of inhumanity. That's what I want you to know. That's what I want you to remember. War is terrible. Trauma is real. But humans have the capacity to survive, to endure, to choose kindness even in the darkest times. And if an old man who lived through the London Blitz can still find hope, can still believe in human goodness, can still think the world is worth fighting for, then maybe you can too. But before I go, I want to leave you with something. A message. A plea, really. From someone who saw what humans are capable of doing to each other. From someone who lived through it. To the young people watching this. You are the future. The world you create, the choices you make, they matter. When you vote, when you speak out, when you choose what kind of person you're going to be, remember what I've told you. Remember that war has real human costs. Remember that peace is worth fighting for. Remember that every person matters. Don't let history repeat itself. Don't let the lessons of the Blitz be forgotten. Don't let future generations have to learn these lessons the hard way, the way we did. Stand up against hatred, against dehumanization, against the rhetoric that makes violence seem acceptable. When you see leaders dividing people, pitting groups against each other, creating enemies, speak out. Because that's how it starts. That's how we end up dropping bombs on children. Value education, learn history. Understand what happened and why, so you can prevent it from happening again. The Blitz didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of political decisions, of escalating tensions, of failures in diplomacy, of choosing conflict over cooperation. These things can be prevented, but only if people understand history and are committed to not repeating it. Support veterans and trauma survivors. If you know someone who's been through war, who's experienced trauma, be patient with them. Be kind. Understand that they're carrying burdens you can't see. Don't expect them to just get over it. Offer support. Listen if they want to talk. Give them space if they need it, and advocate for better mental health services for survivors of all kinds of trauma. Work for peace. This doesn't mean being naive about threats. This doesn't mean pacifism at all costs. but it means making peace the goal. It means trying diplomacy before resorting to violence. It means treating negotiations seriously. It means being willing to compromise. It means remembering that war should always, always be the last resort, because the cost is so incredibly high. And on a personal level, choose kindness. In your daily life, in your interactions with others, choose compassion. Choose understanding. Choose to see the humanity in others, even when they seem different from you. Especially when they seem different from you. The Blitz taught me that we're all just people. Rich or poor, British or German, adult or child. We all feel fear, we all feel pain, we all love our families, we all want to feel safe. When we forget that, when we start seeing others as less than human, that's when terrible things become possible. So remember the humanity of others. Remember that every person has a story, has feelings, has people who love them. Remember that violence creates trauma that echoes through generations. Remember that war takes so much more than lives. It takes innocence. It takes peace of mind. It takes futures that will never be lived. I was 7 years old when the Blitz started. 7 years old when my childhood ended. 7 years old when I learned what fear really was. I'm 92 now. I've had 85 years to process what happened to me. 85 years to try to make sense of it. 85 years to try to find meaning in the suffering. And here's what I've concluded. The only meaning we can give to senseless violence is to prevent it from happening again. The only way to honor those who died is to build a world where such deaths don't happen. The only way to make sense of my trauma is to use my story to maybe, possibly, prevent someone else from experiencing the same thing. That's why I'm telling you this. That's why I'm sharing my story, despite how painful it is to relive these memories. Because if my words can change even one mind, can inspire even one person to choose peace over violence, understanding over hatred, then maybe it was worth it. Maybe Johnny's death and all those other deaths weren't completely meaningless. Maybe something good can come from something so terrible. I won't be here much longer to tell this story. But you will be. You can carry it forward. You can remember. You can learn from it. You can make sure that future generations know what the Blitz was really like. Not the sanitized version. Not the heroic myth. But the real, terrifying, traumatic truth of it. Promise me something. Promise me you'll remember. Promise me you'll tell others. Promise me you'll work for a world where no child has to go through what I went through. Where no child has to sleep in a shelter listening to bombs fall. Where no child has to see their friends die. Where no child has to grow up too fast because adults couldn't find a better way to resolve their conflicts. Can you promise me that? Can you carry this forward? Because that's all I have left to give. My story, my memories, my hope that maybe, just maybe, future generations will be wiser than ours was. That maybe you'll find ways to solve problems without resorting to violence. That maybe you'll remember that every bomb, every bullet, every act of war creates trauma that lasts lifetimes. I was a child during the London Blitz. I survived, but part of me is still there. Will always be there, huddled in a shelter, listening to the world end above me, wondering if I'll see another morning. Don't let there be more children like me. Please, for the love of God, don't let this happen again. That's my message. That's what I want you to remember. That's what I'm begging you, pleading with you, to take forward into the future. Remember us, remember what we went through, and make sure it never happens again. I want to show you something. I still have it after all these years. Do you see this piece of metal? It's about 3 inches long, twisted and scorched. It's a piece of shrapnel from the Blitz. I picked it up the morning after that first night, September 8th, 1940. I was 7 years old, and I thought it was treasure, a souvenir of survival. I've carried this piece of metal with me for 85 years. It's moved with me from house to house. It survived when so much else was lost, and when I hold it, I'm right back there. 7 years old, terrified, alive against all odds. This piece of metal represents so much. It represents the bombs that fell, the fear we felt, the people we lost. But it also represents something else. It represents survival, resilience, the refusal to be broken. We survived. Against impossible odds, through unimaginable circumstances, we survived. London survived. Britain survived. And not just survived, but rebuilt, recovered, moved forward. That doesn't mean it was easy. That doesn't mean there weren't costs. As I've told you, the costs were enormous and are still being paid. But we did it. We survived. And if we could survive the Blitz, then you can survive whatever challenges you're facing. I'm not comparing your problems to being bombed every night for 8 months. But the principle is the same. Humans are capable of surviving terrible things. We're capable of carrying on even when it seems impossible. We're capable of finding hope in the darkest places. You are stronger than you think, more resilient than you realize, capable of more than you imagine. I know because I've seen it. I've lived it. But remember this. Survival isn't the same as being unaffected. Survival doesn't mean you have to pretend you're okay when you're not. It's okay to be scarred. It's okay to need help. It's okay to admit that what you've been through has changed you. I spent decades pretending I was fine. Don't make that mistake. If you're struggling, get help. Talk to someone. Reach out. There's no shame in it. The shame is in suffering alone when you don't have to. And if you know someone who's struggling, be there for them. Listen. Don't judge. Don't expect them to just get over it. Trauma doesn't work that way. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply witness someone else's pain. Simply say, I see you, I hear you. Your experience matters. I've been talking for over an hour now. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share my story. It's not easy to revisit these memories. But it's important. These stories need to be told. They need to be heard. They need to be remembered. The last survivors of the Blitz are dying out. Soon, there won't be anyone left who remembers it firsthand. When that happens, when we're all gone, the Blitz will become just history, and history is easily forgotten, easily distorted, easily repeated. But if you've watched this video, if you've heard my story, then you're part of keeping that memory alive. You're part of making sure these lessons aren't forgotten. You're part of building a better future. So go forward with that knowledge. Go forward with that responsibility. Tell others what you've learned. Share this video. Have conversations about war and peace and trauma and survival. Keep these stories alive, because the dead can't speak for themselves. Johnny can't tell you about his love of cricket. The 43,000 civilians killed in the Blitz can't tell you about their lives, their hopes, their dreams. But I can. While I'm still here, I can speak for them. I can tell you that they mattered, that they were people, not statistics, that their deaths were tragedies, each and every one. And when I'm gone, you can speak for them. You can remember. You can make sure they're not forgotten. That's all any of us can really ask for, isn't it? To be remembered, to have our stories told, to have our lives mean something beyond just ourselves. The Blitz shaped me. It shaped my entire life. In many ways, it made me who I am. I wish it hadn't happened. I wish I'd had a normal childhood. I wish Johnny was still alive. I wish none of it had ever happened. But it did happen. And I survived it, and now I've told you about it. And that, in some strange way, makes it matter. Makes the suffering mean something. Makes the survival count for something. So thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about the story of an old man and his memories of being a child during wartime. Thank you for taking the time to understand what it was really like. And please, please learn from it. Let these hard-won lessons inform your choices. Let this knowledge shape how you see the world and your place in it. Let this story be a reminder of what we're capable of. both the terrible and the wonderful. We can drop bombs on children, but we can also run into burning buildings to save strangers. We can create weapons of mass destruction, but we can also share our last piece of food with a hungry neighbor. We can wage war, but we can also build peace. The choice is ours, individually and collectively. Every day, in every action. What kind of world do we want to create? What kind of people do we want to be? I'm 92 years old. I've seen the worst of what humans can do, but I've also seen the best, and I still have hope. Despite everything, I still believe we can do better. We can be better. We can create a world where no child has to experience what I experienced. But it's up to you now. It's your world to shape. I'm just an old man with memories and stories. You're the ones who have to live in the future. You're the ones who have to make the choices. Choose wisely, choose kindly, choose peace, and remember. Please remember. I was 7 years old when the bombs came. I'm 92 years old now, and I'm still here, still surviving, still hoping, still believing that my story matters, that these memories matter, that the lessons of the Blitz matter. Don't let them be forgotten. Thank you for listening, thank you for remembering, and thank you for carrying these stories forward into the future. May you never have to live through what we lived through. May your children and grandchildren never know the terror of bombs falling from the sky. May the world learn, finally learn, that there are no winners in war, only survivors, and that the cost of survival is often higher than anyone realizes. Take care of each other, be kind, choose peace, and remember the child I was, the children we all were, during the London Blitz. Our stories matter, our lives mattered. We were here, we survived. We remember. And now, so do you. Before you go, I have one more request. If this video moved you, if my story touched you, please share it. Share it with your friends, your family, your students. Share it on social media. Send it to people you think need to hear it, because these stories need to reach as many people as possible while we're still here to tell them. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me if you have family members who lived through the Blitz or other wars. Share your own stories. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's create a community of people committed to remembering, to learning, to building a more peaceful world. And if you're a teacher, please consider showing this video to your students. History isn't just dates and names and battles. It's people, it's stories, it's understanding what it was really like. Help the next generation understand. Help them learn from our experiences. If you want to learn more about the Blitz, I've put some links in the description below. Books written by survivors, museum exhibits, documentaries. There's so much more to explore, so many more stories to hear. And finally, if you're struggling with trauma of any kind, please reach out for help. I've also put some mental health resources in the description. You don't have to suffer alone. There are people who can help, organizations that specialize in trauma support. Please use them. Don't wait 60 years like I did. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to an old man's memories, for caring about history, for taking the time to understand what we went through. Now go forward and make a difference. Be the generation that finally learns from history. Be the generation that chooses peace. Be the generation that makes sure no child ever has to hide from bombs again. I believe in you. I have hope for the future because of people like you, people who are willing to listen, to learn, to care. Go make me proud. Go make the world better. Go prove that we survived for a reason. And never forget, I was a child during the London Blitz, and I remember. And now, so do you. Thank you, God bless you, and may you never know war.